Latin America produces more than 50% of the world's copper and is home to 40% of the world's copper reserves. Good morning, everyone, and welcome. My name is Ryan Berg, and I'm the director of the Americas program here at CSIS. Thank you so very much for joining us for this wonderful event where we're launching a new digital report called Latin America, the World's Copper Stronghold. The demand for copper continues to surge as everything from electric vehicles, new AI data centers, and infrastructure uses continue to rise. It is estimated that to meet the current administration's net zero carbon emissions requirements, the U.S. annual copper supply will need to double by 2035. A key challenge for the United States is that it only mines 5% of the world's copper. And despite long-time free trade agreements with copper-producing and copper-rich Latin American countries, the United States still struggles to secure its copper supply chain from its southern neighbors. Latin America could be a strategic partner to the United States, given that countries like Chile, Peru, and Mexico both produce much of the world's copper, but also hold large shares of copper reserves, and they are geographically close to the United States. I have the great good fortune of being joined this afternoon by my colleague, Gracelyn Baskarin, who's the director of our newly inaugurated Critical Minerals Security Program, where she and her team focus on research surrounding building resilient mineral supply chains needed for national, economic, and energy security. The Critical Minerals Program and the Americas Program have worked hand in hand and laboriously together on this very timely report. So Gracelyn, I want to start this event this morning by asking you to discuss a little bit the digital report, which is now available on CSIS's website. In it, we sought to highlight the challenges and the opportunities Latin America presents in the copper sector, in particular players like Chile and Peru. Why is copper important? Can you tell me about the current copper supply chain?
Well, first, Ryan, it's wonderful to be here. Thank you so much for having us and for being such a great partner on this project. Latin America is truly the center of the copper world, and we look at the future. In the U.S., we have a tendency, and globally in critical minerals dialogue, to think of critical minerals as a mass. But commodities are actually so different. And copper is particularly unique. We currently live in a world where lithium, nickel, and cobalt prices are on multi-year lows, but copper prices actually crashed through a record high ceiling this year. And a lot of this is because most of our base metals that I mentioned are primarily used in electric vehicles, and sales aren't what we thought they would be. But copper is important for every part of our economy and security. So when I say that, it is by weight the second most used commodity in defense technologies. It is the number one commodity when you look at the total sum of how much we need in terms of IEA estimates for reaching our net zero ambitions for EVs, wind, solar, the entire clean tech orbit. And it's also a core part of everyday modern technology. I mean, copper's in your washing machine. So when I look at growing populations, AI, energy transition, copper is at the center of all of that. So that's why you see that a majority of the world's commodity exploration today is sitting in copper projects.
Thanks very much, Gracelyn. This report, I think, front and center of some of our findings and really the crux of it was also looking not just at where copper is, but also the great power competition aspect to it, the role of China in copper, and the ability of Latin American countries to partner with the United States to bring more copper online. And so one thing that we discovered in the course of researching this report is that China has only about 5% of the world's copper reserves, but they developed such an advantage in the supply chain. How did that happen?
So China has made minerals for the better part of 50 years the mainstay of not only domestic industrial strategy, but also foreign policy. Acknowledging that they had limited commodities at home, they worked to secure minerals from abroad. And through that, we're able to bring it back. China had a decades-long advantage on what I like to call the mine-to-market supply chain across sectors. They didn't just want to mine it, they didn't want to just process it, but they also manufactured the goods using the copper. So if we look over to our graph on the left, what we see is this is production by region. And what we see here is that with Latin America being on the green, you have a region that's producing almost half of the world copper in terms of the actual raw amount of ore being pulled out of the ground. That red box is China. So we see that actually China and the United States in blue produce roughly about the same amount of the world's copper, which is negligible compared to Latin America. However, as I mentioned, remember, China may not have everything in the ground, but they learned to secure it from other countries. So if we move to refined copper, which is kind of that midstream from when I take the copper out of my ground, but before it's ready to use for a manufactured good, China has a very dominant position in terms of the actual refined copper. So if I look at China, China is our red bar at the top. So they refine about 12 million tons a year. The next biggest is Chile with 2 million tons. So we're essentially realizing is that Chile, as number 2 in the world, is about 15% of China's refined output. Then China is able to manufacture the goods. So the majority of value addition is currently happening in China, even though the geology is in Latin America.
It's quite a dramatic graph that we just had up on the screen, and in many ways, Latin America is a perfect region for China given its dominance in the refining space, because a lot of the offtake agreements will then, of course, go to China. China can bring some of that value add and then send back to Latin America and the Caribbean for the production of goods. One of the things that we also talked about in the report was the strategies that you've just talked about China using in order to build up such a dominant position in the refining space. And of course, we have to juxtapose this to the United States, which doesn't have some of those tools, owing to the fact that we don't have an economy that operates like China's. We don't have a party state that can direct state-owned enterprises where to enter, where to invest, and so on. And so the question is, how does the United States compete? This was one of the things that we wanted to delve into a little bit in the report.
So, I mean, we should start with like, how far behind are we? And then how do we compete? Because sometimes it's like we need to assess how many miles to go when we look at what that is. So, I mean, some fast facts for you are, China exported 68% of its copper to China, Chile exported 68% of its copper to China, but 1%, right, to the United States. Peru sent 76% to China, 1% to the United States. So when we think about the notion of how do we compete, we accept that we're not a command economy, right? So what we see here over time is Chile. This is a great graph where you see back in 2001, which is our bars at the top, like copper trade to the U.S. and China from Chile were roughly the same, right? So we're talking about just under 25 years ago. Now we move it a decade later to 2011, we see that China actually made a tremendous amount of progress between 2001 to 2011. The US was not meaningfully pursuing mining in these years. These were the quiet years. We closed our Bureau of Mines in 1996. That was our centralized coordinating agency. And then we didn't really think about it again until the executive order in 2017. Meanwhile, China made significant amounts of progress here. And then if you look by 2021, we see that Chile sent $28 billion worth of copper to China and just over $6 billion to the United States. And that, if we move over to Peru, it's a very similar story that we see replicated. In fact, back in 2001, Peru sent more copper to the United States than China. But then again, what we saw is between 2001 and 2011, that narrative changed. And between 2011 and 21, it jumped to the point that it's over 12 billion versus less than 500 million. So it's a pattern that we see replicating across Latin American countries because China was very good at it. And China has leveraged soft power very strategically, right? We can delve more into the example of Chile, but they've used financing, infrastructure, government-to-government agreements, and that's helped them move the needle in a very meaningful way and enabled long-term offtake agreements.
Go into this for a second on the long-term offtake agreements. This is something that the report delves into a little bit, and expand on that point, because that's given China, it's my understanding, this tremendous advantage because you have companies with a guaranteed stable price for their product for many, many years in the future, and it makes basically the financials of projects more viable. Is that right?
Yeah, you want stability. I mean, the mining sector for as long as time has existed has been marked by price ups and downs, booms and busts. It's a cyclical industry. So what long-term offtake agreements do is, first of all, it guarantees me an offtaker, right? So I know somebody's going to buy what I produce and it's not going to be sitting above the ground when I take it out. But it also ensures that there's some sort of stability of price, right? This is really important. And this is where, if we, coming back to these prices, is we've seen that prices, we're a capitalistic economy. Prices matter. There's a reason now that 47% of, exploration, like significant amount of exploration is in copper. It's because when most prices have gone down, copper prices have gone up. When we look at opportunity, when I look at Latin America, which is a group of very different countries, right? There's a reason that Argentina has become a very strategic priority for the United States when we talk to the likes of the Development Finance Corporation. And one of them is that Argentina doesn't have any major exporting copper projects right now. And as we know in the report, they do have 34 projects that are under various stages of development. If you want to get a long-term offtake agreement, the best time is to do it early on. It's, because those agreements, by title, they're long, right? I want to get in there early. So compared to Chile, which has a number of copper exporting projects, or Peru, Argentina is in a more nascent stage right now.
So when do these offtake agreements usually begin? You said that the best time to get in is right away at the beginning. When do they normally take place? When do those agreements normally get signed?
So what often happens is there are exploration companies who are going to go in, they're going to do the exploration, and then they sell it to a production company, right? Exploration and production companies are often different companies. Now the production, when you move into the building the mine in the production phase, is when you would want to have those long-term offtake agreements signed. Right now, as we touch on in the report, there's only a couple of active smelters in the United States. There's 2. And then we also have a couple in Latin America, but this essentially means that that long-term offtake is going to China because they have the capacity to refine at scale.
So let's talk about some of the graphs that were just up on the screen. So copper prices was one of them. That was the previous graph that we showed. And it basically shows that copper prices are very strong. That they have had, of course, fluctuations, as all minerals do, but not nearly as much trouble in terms of increasing price as other minerals. And then again, if we look here, we see a very high price of copper. One of the things that we make as a point in the report is that a company's decision to mine is primarily the result of 2 basic considerations: the geology that you mentioned, and also the economics of it, which is here in this graph. But there's also political and social risk, which I want to get to later in our conversation. But first, I want to ask about the where that we found in this report. We have this great graphic on copper exploration budget. You just threw out the numbers, about the really astounding numbers about how much copper exploration is actually happening in Latin America. Where are companies mining in the region? What are they doing to conduct exploration in the region? What makes it, such a and what makes it such a hot region for copper?
So there's 2 things that we consider when we consider geology, because geology is first and foremost. We have a friend who's a senator who once said, I don't understand why we don't mine in America first, and before we go elsewhere. And the reality is because you can't make a full EV battery, for example, if I only used what I had in the United States. So Latin America has both significant quantities of copper, but also good quality copper reserves. And so, as we said, 46% of the world, if we have the exploration map, 46% of the world's copper exploration is currently in Latin America. This is really significant when you also consider you have big players like Canada and the U.S. and Australia, which are also kind of in those shades of green. So first of all, is 46% is there. Additionally, it's not just 1 or 2 countries. If you look at the top 12 countries that received copper exploration last year, 7 of them were actually in Latin America. 7. So over half, right? You have Chile, Peru, Ecuador, Brazil, Argentina, Mexico, Colombia, and I guess if we want to round out the Americas, it's the U.S. So when we think about it that way, is companies see that the geology in Latin America is good. The second thing companies look for when they make a decision goes back to the political, economic, and social risk factors. And what that means is that mining is a very long-term industry. I'm not going in for 5 years or 10 years. I can't just close it and relocate it. But I want to know that when I'm going in, that I have security of my project, my agreements that I signed going in on taxes, et cetera, are going to be the same. Argentina is a fascinating example of a country. It's one of receives a significant amount of exploration for commodities as a whole. It's a top 5 in the world. But you and I both know their macro situation is complicated. Their
to say the least.
Yeah, their political situation is complicated. But major Western mining companies are all over Argentina because they know that from the time I explore to the time that I have a producing mine can easily be 10, 15 years, right? And because Argentina has had stability of mining policies dating back to the 1990s, it's almost a this too shall pass phase for the economics and the politics because the geology checks out and they've had stable mining private sector policies. So Latin America is attractive because of the geology, but also when I weigh out my other risk considerations, it's a good long-term bet.
Argentina is an interesting case, and let's just dwell there for a second because you mentioned the importance of it and indeed the growing importance of copper exploration in a country like Argentina. We showed the map earlier. Chile was obviously quite a bright color. Argentina less so, but I think a lot of conversation is on how in future years Argentina could really surge past countries like Chile. One of the things is the geology, which you mentioned. Another is the fact that very favorable mining policies are in place still from the Menem period in the 1990s. The other thing I would note is something that the Milei government has managed to pass in recent times, which is an exemption to these cumbersome capital controls that often hinder a lot of other private sector companies from making large-scale investments in Argentina. They have exempted mining from the capital controls, and so that obviously brings a lot more stability to this industry as well. And now we're at the point where frankly, it sounds like there's so much investment in exploration in a country like Argentina and excitement about the potential for Argentina. We're at the point where the investment and the potential finds and future mines might outstrip the ability of the infrastructure, for example, to support very rural operations in places like Tacataca, where there aren't even roads necessarily to the mine in question there.
You make a great point, Ryan, which is the ecosystem of mining. I know we talk a lot, obviously, about production and processing, but these are incredibly energy intensive. It's for big mining countries, mining is generally takes up the largest share of energy in terms of grid capacity of any industry, right? It's incredibly water intensive. In an era of climate change, like complications deepening, that water infrastructure has to come from somewhere. And that we can come back to this, but some of this drives social unrest. Because if I am in a rural area without electricity or without a lot of water, but the mine is using a significant amount of water and power, it then becomes a driver of social unrest, which is what we've seen in countries like Peru, where you have growing tension between farmers and miners, right? I wrote something years ago, it must have been like 6 or 7 years ago, called, when will farming or mining essentially win in Peru? And since then, it's actually deepened the challenges. So the ecosystem that you're talking about of what it needs, the roads and everything, is really a way that the U.S., you can come back, can be thinking about how to build collaboration with Latin America to strengthen that cooperation.
You've given me a nice segue into my next question, and I will come back to the social conflictivity of mining in a bit because we had to deal with that in this report. But first thing I want to talk about is just the capital intensity, which you've mentioned. In recent years, there's been an acceleration of efforts by the U.S. government to de-risk some of these projects and reduce the cost of the capital required in Latin American mining projects, including through institutions or agencies like the Development Finance Corporation. My question to you is, what other tools do we have for de-risking? What are your your recommendations for de-risking to the U.S. government, other than the DFC, which is a conversation we hear a lot about here in Washington?
So I want to tee that up with one point, which is I'm going to use Chile as an example of this, which is the cost of capital to get a ton of copper out of the ground now is 5 times as much as it was back in 2006. And there's a couple things we need to remember. If I look at BHP's biggest mine, which is the biggest mine in the world, Escondida, the ore quality has gone down significantly over the years, and I'm digging deeper and deeper to get to that lower quality ore, which means that my profit margin is dropping quite significantly.
Sure.
So when I think about capital, I also have to acknowledge that capital is scarce, interest rates are high, this sector is risky, but also for some of these companies who've had these incredibly big and successful projects, their profit margins are shrinking, right? These are all part of the calculus that we take into account. So that turns back around to the question of what can the US do? I think there's a couple things. I think the DFC is an important one, but the DFC has mixed abilities in a place like Latin America. It can't finance anything in Chile right now because it can't finance in high income countries, right? Chile is an incredibly important country. So when I think about the fact that the DFC is up for reauthorization, a core thing is, can we make it better fit for mining? Which means revisiting the countries, like one thing we can do is make it non-OECD high-income countries, right? A second thing would be is to think about more projects looking at the mining ecosystem, because sometimes the private sector will go finance and build the mine, but they don't want to build all of the infrastructure around the mine. That makes a project cost prohibitive, right? Another thing that we've seen success with is government-to-government cooperation agreements. And this can do a couple of things. There are vast parts of Latin America that are unexplored or underexplored, right? And we have a fantastic U.S. Geological Survey here in the U.S. We have fantastic geologists in the U.S. And we should be leveraging that to provide support to ensuring that mapping is being done in Latin America, which then de-risks exploration, which then is more likely to lead to production projects that we can sign offtake agreements in, right? 1. 2, goes back to infrastructure. We have things in the African context. We have Power Africa, which was an initiative that was literally set up to electrify Africa and has played a huge hand in increasing energy access on the continent. But retooling that for how do we build infrastructure capacity is the second one. And then a third one, which is really important, and I have a friend of ours who's an ambassador said this. He says, building processing capabilities is often commercially stupid, but strategically important. And that hits the nail on the head. Copper companies, and this is not just Latin America, globally will tell you smelting, processing, refining, often not profitable. However,
the margins are quite slim.
They're slim, and when prices are volatile, it's even worse. Or if you have a water shortage or a power shortage, it's worse, right? But I can't reduce my long-term reliance on a foreign adversary without that long-term strategic foresight, and the government is going to have to prepare to take on more of that risk and cost. So it requires both the government and the private sector to come to the table for us to be strategically wise and not end up in the same predicament in 5, 10, or 20 years.
I think the point about the DFC is spot on. It's a balance. The DFC right now is set up as a balance between the poverty eradication mandate and the investment in places that are underfunded or underdeveloped, and the compete with China mandate. And to your point about the reauthorization of the DFC, some clarification on where the balance of that ledger should be would be quite useful, because at the present moment, investments in Chile are possible, but they're very difficult, meaning you need to get a national security finding that investment in a high-income country like Chile is actually worth making from an institution like the DFC. But it's not just the DFC and some of the other tools that you've described, Gracelyn, it's also about incentives. And so I wanted to ask you a question about the Inflation Reduction Act, which also features in our report, especially in some of the recommendations. The IRA was designated to create tax incentives for U.S.-oriented green energy supply chains. It offers tax credits, as many of our viewers will know, for electric vehicle purchases if a certain amount of the mineral sourcing requirements are met. But copper is not part of the critical minerals list that the IRA uses to determine eligibility. So, simple question to you, why is this? And if that isn't going to change anytime soon, what other incentives that are similar to these kinds in the tax code or other kind of investment schemes might the U.S. government consider?
So a few things. I think the Inflation Reduction Act has been incredibly catalytic for supporting a number of minerals projects. And in theory, Latin America should be a prime beneficiary, right? It has more free trade agreements than any other region of the world in terms of, the absolute number. There's a couple things, though, that we acknowledge. The first is that the IRA is a relatively new piece of legislation. It's a couple of years old. So it's really hard for us to say, oh, it's been successful or it hasn't, because again, it goes back to the point that sometimes we need to get these projects early on. I can't just rewire trade. I mean, you know that China has free trade agreements with Chile as well. So it's not that the U.S. is the only country with a free trade agreement. So it's not going to be that thing that tips exports over on a sudden basis over to the United States, right? So the first thing is acknowledging that the IRA is nascent, and so the results that we've seen, particularly internationally with our mining investments, are a bit too early to tell because we're not seeing those drastic rewiring of exports. The second thing is copper not being on the critical minerals list is a product of a couple things. So first of all, the big one is that we do produce a fair bit of copper. We are a top copper producer globally. It's not a significant share, but we do produce. And so when I think of criticality, when the government thinks of criticality, depending on which department, the list you're looking at, is supply chain disruption is one of the key things that that is taken into account. And because the U.S. produces copper, Australia, Canada it's not viewed as being as vulnerable to supply chain disruptions, number one. The second thing you have to consider is a time horizon that we look at. Is the critical minerals list generally, like the USGS looks, is retrospective. It looks backwards. So it starts to say, okay, here is kind of what mineral patterns have been, and therefore this is where our vulnerabilities look forward. Whereas Department of Energy uses a much more forward-looking exercise in terms of how important it is to energy, how likely are we to not have it. And as a result, what then happens is it does feature on the Department of Energy's list, but the DOE list is not what we use for the IRA. Now, when it comes to the really important question to me, which is new incentives, right? It's a very pivotal month in American history in terms of, there's a new administration either way, right? And so there's new policies that are going to come to be. Is we need to look at copper policies differently than we look at EV policies. Because copper is used, like I said, it's the second most used commodity in terms of defense technologies. It is used across the energy transition. It is used in almost every form of economic security when I think about day-to-day life technologies. So these need to feature in the incentive. Our program published a paper earlier last month looking at semiconductors, and we look at the minerals for semiconductors. We note that with $280 billion going to chips, the CHIPS Act, nothing was used for the actual minerals, right? So we're going to think in the next 4 years more about how do we strengthen minerals across end uses, not just EVs. And incentives for copper are incredibly important, whether it's, defense, economic competitiveness, energy transition.
Essentially, you can't electrify something if you don't have copper, and you can't move electrons across a space without copper. I promised we would get to mining conflicts, and I want to transition to that now, because it also came up in the research that we did for this report. Look, mining is a complex industry. You've said it on many occasions. Latin America, the mining space in the region can be a complicated one. To date, the Observatory of Mining Conflicts of Latin America has registered almost 300 what they call social conflicts over mining, which is more than any other region in the world. And so there's this data point that we like to throw out as a program, that Latin America has more mining-related conflicts than any region of the world. The majority of them are in Mexico, Chile, and Peru, countries that are the direct subjects of this report. And I think the reason is, or the reasons, are reasons we've unpacked before. in other contexts. Local communities often feel as though they don't get their fair share, they don't get the profits from the country's mineral wealth. And in countries like Panama and Peru, social unrest often unfolds around mines in an effort to shut down operations. So my question to you is, what can be done to generate a greater social license to mine, the ability to engage in mining with more buy-in from local communities and less of this conflictivity around the mining?
Ryan, this is perhaps one of the most important questions. Every year, Ernst & Young does a survey of mining executives around the world, and social license to operate remains their number one concern. Because if a community wants to stop operations of a mine, they can stop operations of a mine. And it doesn't matter how much capital that you have sunk into that operation. At that point, it basically brings it to a halt. So there's a couple things I'm thinking of right now. So I was speaking to someone about Mexico yesterday, and we were talking about the potential ban on open pit mining. And again, I mean, the one exception to the open pit ban would be things in national interest, right? Is countries across the region, and more broadly across the world, will allow mining when they see it as being beneficial to them and not just being as something that benefits everybody else, but at the harm of them. That's really important. There's kind of three areas where we see a particular challenge, I think, in the Latin American region with social license to operate. Maybe four. So one is environmental consequences. And this open pit mining is particularly environmentally degrading, but you have things like acid mine drainage, right? And what this does is it can make the land around mines, and you can't grow food on it anymore. And for rural communities, this literally undermines food security, right? And so for them, it's not worth it to mine if they can't turn around and farm on that land. That's been particularly acute in Peru, where a lot of the mine unrest has been driven by farmers. A second thing is going to be the health consequences that come from mining. We know historically the amount of just disease and illness around mines, particularly through the type of mining that has been done, has been particularly high. We see that I previously worked in the Africa region. Mine sites were the drivers of HIV and tuberculosis, right? And mining companies being able to step in and build those community hospitals was pivotal to turning around the legacy of mining in these areas and ensuring that workers who were in gold mines were getting the treatment that they needed. And then the last one being water, and which links to environmental, but in an industry that is very water intensive, but where you have less water with climate change in many places.
So Peru and Chile are some of the driest places on Earth.
And we've seen those droughts in recent years, right? Yeah. It becomes incredibly important that those water resources are being stewarded and capacity is being built. And so these are some of the factors that are driving a lot of this unrest. And what companies need to do, there's a couple things. As historically, we have used in mining a participatory approach. Like, we'll invite you to the consultation. Like, we'll make sure we tick box, our engagement with you. But really putting in community-centric approaches, making sure that they are part of the process of mine development from the very beginning. Because what mining communities want is, A, they want to make sure they're protected, but two, they want a fair share of those benefits. They don't just want it going to multinational companies, going to governments who may reallocate the revenue that it's going, to the capital city for infrastructure development while leaving rural areas underdeveloped. It's ensuring that companies are leading the way with government to reduce the friction between workers, communities, firms, and government. And we're seeing companies get much better at this. I mean, I can tell you, for example, Anglo-American is completely off-grid as an example in Latin America, right? Which means that it frees up energy capacity for communities, right? Mm-hmm. Rather than take energy offline for communities. But other companies, BHP, a number of companies are work on the energy and ensuring that they're electrifying cleanly and making energy available for others reduces that. So that's really the heart, is reducing the tension and mining responsibly. And the U.S. has an important role to make sure that we're pushing ahead to do it right.
I want to bring I want to bring myself closer to the exit question for you, Gracelyn, and I'll probably ask you two more questions. But getting us closer to the exit of this event. Can the United States compete with China in the copper space?
We can compete. You didn't ask me if we can catch up. That's a different question. We can absolutely compete, but it's going to take a more whole of government, not just a whole of government approach with the U.S., but working with our allies like Canada. Canada is an incredibly important ally and neighbor. Also has copper. It's going to be working with our Australian counterparts. It's going to be working together to advance our mutual cooperation in a way that makes mining beneficial to Latin American countries and the United States and our allies. We can compete. It's going to require fiscal intervention. It's going to require incentives, right, to get the private sector to go in. It's going to require de-risking. It's going to require spending on infrastructure. But are we going to catch up today or tomorrow or in the next 5 years? No, we're not. What we can do is reduce our reliance on China steadily, and that should be the goal. The goal should be
That's what winning looks like.
That is what winning looks like.
Okay.
Winning looks like that refinery production in 5 years from now.
This is a great graph here because this shows us the challenge that we're facing.
Exactly, yeah. It's the red. I love the red.
Yeah.
It's like in 10 years, 45% should not be 45. Shouldn't be 40. I mean, it shouldn't be 30. It should be like, we want to drop that number in a linear way if we are to meaningfully reduce the gap in our reliance on China. Now, that is going to require, going back to the fact that refining capabilities are not always commercially attractive, but strategically important, it is going to require government support. And targeted efforts at copper is important because we're not going to have defense technology without copper. We're not going to have an energy transition without copper. And we're not going to have a lot of the devices we use in our hands and at work every day without it. So that success is making sure 45% continually goes down.
Gracelyn, I'd like to congratulate you and the Critical Minerals program here at CSIS on this excellent report, as well as the authors from our team, Chris Hernandez-Roy, our Deputy Director and Senior Fellow, and Henry Seymour, our Associate Fellow, as well as Fabio Murga, who's also contributed to this report. Latin America, the world's copper stronghold, is now live on the CSIS website. The numbers speak for themselves, folks. The supply of copper in the region, the production, and the exploration numbers, they are really astounding. This is an issue we're going to continue working on. Thank you all for joining us online, and thank you for your time. This concludes our event today.